What is the soft landing, and will the US economy have won in 2024? These are the questions on investors' minds. With stock markets reaching all-time highs, the bet on a soft landing is getting bigger by the day. In this video, I will cover what a soft landing is. I will also attempt to define various factors that can make or break a soft landing in 2024.
Let's define soft landing first. The Federal Reserve has a dual mandate. It involves achieving maximum employment and stable prices. The Federal Reserve does so through changes in the money supply or interest rates. The interest rate that the Fed controls is the federal funds rate. It is the rate at the overnight credit market for lending bank reserves. As for bank reserves, they are the smallest cash reserves that banks must keep in vaults as required by the Fed.
When the Federal Reserve wants to fight inflation, it tightens its monetary policy. Inflation is the sign of excessive demand or insufficient supply of products. While the Fed has no control over supply, it can influence the demand in the economy. To tighten its monetary policy, the Fed raises the federal funds rate. This increases the interest rates in the economy and makes credit more expensive. First, there is no official definition of soft landing or hard landing. It is a notion that was popularized in 1970s after the successful moon landing by American astronauts in 1969. The idea behind the soft landing is to slow down the aggregate demand in the economy and avoid the recession.
If the Fed takes out some steam, but not too much, it engineers the soft landing. This means lower inflation around 2% target and no material increase in unemployment. Also, no recession or a very small one is a must for a soft landing. Economists use up to 2-year period post-tightening to gauge if the Fed succeeded. If monetary tightening causes recession, you have a hard landing.
So, as we see, it's a very narrow path that the Fed must navigate to a soft landing. It's like a holy grail of monetary policy. Achieving a soft landing is very difficult. Why? There are actually two main reasons. The first reason is a long and changing lag between the Fed's tightening and its effect in the economy. Moreover, it's very difficult to quantify how the interest rate changes will affect the economy. The Fed has some vague idea how the tightening affects GDP, unemployment, or inflation. The economists use the theoretical models for this. But mind you, these theoretical models can only guide monetary policy. In no way they can predict the precise outcomes.
Let's say the Fed raises the funds rate by 1% or 100 basis points. This interest rate change will affect the economy in a gradual manner with a lag. First, nominal interest rates in credit markets go up with some delay. For instance, interest rates on home mortgages, credit cards, and car loans increase. Next, households change their borrowing and spending behavior based on seeing higher rates. All this takes time of at least a year or longer. Moreover, households may not even respond to changes in interest rates at all. Other factors, such as expectations of economic performance and inflation, affect households' actions.
For instance, households may expect strong job market and higher wages in the future. In this scenario, the households may not even change their behavior, and the federal funds rate that got increased may not have even any effect on the economy. And this will force the officials of the Fed to crank up the monetary policy even more. And this is where the problem lies. These long and changing lags create a danger of human error. After all, the Fed is governed by people, not robots. If policymakers see no effect from their monetary tightening, they may tighten even more. And this creates a risk of so-called overshooting. The Fed may tighten too much and create a hard landing in the process. The other danger to soft landings comes from external supply shocks. The Fed has no control over them, and they happen very often and out of the blue. For instance, in 2022, Russia invaded Ukraine, and this caused a lot of disruptions to grain supply on the market. You may know that Ukraine is one of the top exporters of corn and wheat. So after the supply disruptions, food inflation came next. Another example of supply shock happened in 1973 when OPEC engineered oil embargo. This led to gasoline shortages and led to double-digit inflation rates. The Fed had to tighten monetary policy, producing a hard landing in the process. Let's examine one case of a hard landing and one case of a soft landing. The Alan Blinder, the Princeton University professor of economics, wrote a paper in 2023 where he examined a history of soft landings from 1965 to 2022. I link this paper down below.
Professor Blinder identified 11 episodes of monetary tightening. Of these 11 episodes, only one of them produced a true soft landing under Alan Greenspan in 1993 to 1995. All other episodes had either hard landings with recessions or somewhat softish scenarios. Consider a monetary tightening episode that happened in 1988 through 1989 with a hard landing. At the beginning of 1988, the unemployment rate was 5.7%. The real GDP growth in the previous year was about 4.5%, but the headline inflation began creeping up above 4%. The federal funds rate stood at 6.6%. Alan Greenspan was the chair of the Federal Open Market Committee at that time. The Fed decided to begin monetary tightening in response to perceived inflation threat. From 1988 to 1989, the federal funds rate went up and peaked at 9.85%. The inflation stabilized. Moreover, the real GDP growth began slowing down in 1989 through the first half of 1990. Things seem to be going fine with the economy, showing a real growth rate above 2%. Unfortunately for the Fed, Iraq invaded Kuwait in August of 1990. This led to oil price spike. The West Texas Intermediate crude increased from $16 per barrel in July to over $40 in a matter of 3 months in 1990. The inflation skyrocketed and pushed the US economy into a recession of 1990 to 1991.
Of course, we can blame Saddam Hussein for this hard landing episode, but it shows how a random event can cause a havoc on even the best laid plans the Fed may have for a soft landing.
The only soft landing happened after the monetary tightening of 1993 through 1995 under Alan Greenspan. This soft landing episode made him a legend among central bankers. At that time, the CPI hovered below 3% with unemployment rate of 6.6%. Such numbers should not have called for any actions at first sight, but the Fed was getting worried about inflationary pressures in 1993, and the Fed decided to act.
Greenspan announced the Fed's first ever target interest rate on February of 1994. Before that, the investors had to play a guessing game with the Fed by watching its actions on the open market. Can you imagine that today?
As the interest rate rose from 3% in 1993 to 6% by 1995, nothing short of a miracle happened. The inflation remained flat at 3% for some time and later plunged to 1.5% in 1998. The economy continued chugging along with the average real GDP growth rate above 4%. Moreover, the unemployment rate continued on a downward path, reaching 3.8% by 2000.
With these numbers in mind, let's make a comparison of this successful soft landing episode with what's happening today. After all, there is a lot of context around this.
The first thing to notice is that the Fed was not trying to fight inflation in 1993 through 1995, unlike today. The CPI peaked at about 9% in 2022, which was the highest reading since 1980s. I know that I'm showing you here headline CPI inflation instead of a core inflation. This is not what the Fed tracks. The Fed targets the core inflation based on personal consumption expenditures. This metric strips out the effect of food and energy prices. The reason is simple. Monetary policy has little influence over them. But let's roll with this analysis since CPI attracts most public attention. The Fed began hiking rates from 0% in 2022 to 5.3% in 2023 to fight raging inflation. This is a massive tightening given that the federal funds rate was below 2.5% or even 0% for the past 15 years. For this reason, the risk of over-tightening is not something to ignore. Conversely, in the 1993-1995 episode, the interest rate started from 3% and rose to 6.6%.
The second difference is that there were no major oil supply shocks for 5 years after 1995. Well, this is not the case today.
The price of crude dropped from $60 per barrel pre-pandemic to negative value and then shot up to $120 in 2022. The economy still depends on oil, and these price shocks affect even core inflation at some point. This volatility is likely to continue given wars and conflicts in the Middle East.
As you may know, the US had to weaken sanctions against Venezuela and let the heavy crude oil flow. While it's true that US is one of the top producers of oil in the world, most of it is light oil. And the US economy is still dependent on the imports of heavy oil from other countries. And heavy oil and light oil have different uses, and the US economy is still dependent on both of them. And other supply shocks, such as war in Ukraine or supply chain problems, didn't help either.
The third difference between 1995 and now lies in globalization and trade. Trade and outsourcing manufacturing arguably brought cheaper prices to the US. Conversely, we observe reshoring and changes to supply chain after the pandemic. COVID-19 exposed flaws in logistics and compelled firms to change their supply sources. Of course, this effect is very hard to assess quantitatively, as it is still happening today. The fourth difference could be productivity. Computers and internet began their rise in 1990s, culminating in dot-com boom and later bust. The period of 1995 to 2000 showed a steady and robust growth in labor productivity. As for the last 10 years, the labor productivity stayed below 2%. While the data is somewhat noisy, we can still see the difference. As for the spike in labor productivity in 2020, it was an artificial one. Most of the job losses in 2020 came from the low-wage industries such as hospitality and leisure. That is the reason behind this temporary increase.
You may be wondering why I am even bringing up productivity. The thing is with productivity is that it can keep the inflation at bay and let the economy grow. As the labor productivity increases, the output and companies' profitability grows. And this allows firms to raise the wages for the labor, as well as keep the prices unchanged. Low labor productivity observed today definitely doesn't help the Fed. We do not know for sure why is that. And some commentators say that, the generative AI will propel the productivity growth higher. But in reality, we don't know that for sure. It may or may not help. It all depends on the adoption rates of AI, as well as its usefulness in general economy.
The fifth difference is the massive fiscal stimulus that happened in 2020 through 2021. None of that happened from 1995 through 2000. The government sent stimulus checks totaling $814 billion. This accounted for 3.5% of the nominal GDP of $23 trillion in 2021. This was huge.
Of course, the goal of stimulus checks was to replace lost wages. According to NBR, about 20% of those stimulus checks actually got saved, and 20% were used to pay down debt, and the remainder was just consumed almost immediately. And when the economy reopened, guess what happened to all those money that got saved? That's right, they were spent. Fiscal stimulus and excessive money printing contributed to inflation that we see today. Also, post-2020 fiscal stimulus led to higher budget deficits. Conversely, the period from 1995 to 2000s had none of that. In fact, they were budget surpluses due to tax increases, economic boom, and defense cuts. So as we see, the differences between now and 1995 are quite stark. The question is, can the Fed engineer a soft landing in 2024? And the answer is, we do not know. We are still in the middle of it. The Fed recently signaled in December 2023 that they are likely done raising interest rates. So a few years will have to go by to see what kind of effect the Fed's interest rates changes will have on the overall economy. What we observe so far is this: the inflation rates started to moderate and the labor market still remains quite healthy. The stock market indices, many of them, reached all-time highs, and it's very likely that they are pricing in already some high likelihood of a soft landing. Still, many things can go wrong. What I have in mind are different external shocks that can ruin the Fed's plans for a soft landing, and these include oil supply constraints, trade wars, or an armed conflict that's ongoing right now in the Middle East. Moreover, the aggregate demand can slow down faster than the Fed anticipated. If the Fed did too much tightening, the hard landing is just around the corner. With a soft landing priced almost close to perfection, any disappointments can lead to crashes in stock market, or at least it can cause lots of volatility. To engineer a soft landing, the Fed must be very skillful, but not only skillful, but lucky. Do you have any of your own reasons why a soft landing may succeed or fail in 2024 or 2025? Please let me know in the comments. I am very curious to hear your perspective. If you learned something new today, please give this video a like and subscribe to my channel for more content about investing and personal finance. If you disagree, please give it a dislike and let me know in the comments too. Thanks for watching.